So good afternoon and welcome back after the coffee break to a session on Multispeed Europe, a session that in my view follows very naturally from what we heard in the previous session on governance. This time we're going to focus on one specific question, and that is the question of whether Europe should or could advance in multi-speeds. Before we start, let me take a minute to introduce a very prestigious panel. I will start from on my left. We have Mateusz Szczurek, who is the Associate Director at the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. On my left, Sandro Gozi, who is the State Secretary for European Affairs in Italy. On my immediate right, we have Matti, who is now the Deputy Minister for EU Affairs in Estonia and currently the Presidency of the EU. To his right, we have a big friend of Bruegel and here very well known in Brussels, Berès, a member of the European Parliament. And last but not least, we have Grünenfelder, who is Director of Avenir Suisse. Thank you all for accepting our invitation to what I think is a very important topic in the context of the future of Europe. If I may say, the concept of multi-speed Europe is not new. When I was a student of European integration back in the 90s, we were talking about variable geometry. At the time, we were talking more about two speeds. In the process of time, speed seemed to have been multiplied. But back then, we were really talking about the issue of Euro versus non-Euro countries. Now, that's no longer the case, but I think one issue that has remained in the context of this discussion is that it's very much a taboo, the concept of not advancing in one speed, of choosing multiple speeds. It's been seen as a threat. So I think it would be important to identify what you think here in the panel, but also our audience, whether you see this as a threat or as an inevitability, and what would be the best way of advancing the future of Europe in an optimal way. So I would really like to do two things, and I will take turns in doing that. The first one is, can we ask what we mean by multi-speed Europe? What is the shape and form that each of our panelists think that multi-speed Europe takes? What is the definition of multi-speed Europe? I don't think it means the same thing to everyone, so it would be important to see how you approach that. And then after that, of course, I'd like to ask you whether you think it's a good idea. Is it a bad idea? Is it a threat? And what we can do to either prevent it if it's a bad idea or encourage it if it's a good idea. So with that, I would like to give the word first to Pervenche. You have been a European parliamentarian for some time now. How do you see that from inside?
Good afternoon. From inside, it nearly looks like an absolute taboo. The Parliament never organized itself regarding the distribution of member states among different chapters of the treaty. Somehow the question started since 1986, I would say, because until 1986 all members were members of the single market. And the day where it started not to be everybody on board was after the Single Act. This is where it all started. And it started because of the Brits. Because the Brits didn't want to go into the euro. And the next step that was going to be the Maastricht Treaty. And this is where it started with an IGC that was launched by France and Germany, Kohl and Mitterrand. Beside, the Brits didn't want to go. And now I think the question is reopened in a very acute timing because of the negotiation of the Brexit. That does reopen the whole discussion on the two-speed Europe in a very different context. There's also one thing I want to recall of what does it mean, a two-speed Europe. Because if I'm going to argue in the second part of this roundtable what I think and where we need to go, I do think that, as I said, since 1986, a multi-speed Europe did exist, and goes on. I mean, it's the three pillars of the treaty that we are trying to narrow down, but that is still there somehow. It's the enhanced cooperation, the structured cooperation, it's written in the treaty, it's the euro, it's Schengen, it's many other things where obviously not all member states are on board like they are in the internal market. But this is a too easy answer to your question. So the most political one and the most significant one for me is, of course, the one that is raised by the question of the Eurozone. Because this is where obviously something of a different magnitude has been settled. And it was because of very historical specific reason. When we were moving to the euro, remember, at that time, we were waiting for the Brits. They were going to join us. They were expecting to wait for 2 years, and Tony Blair had promised a referendum, where Gordon Brown had defined the condition for this referendum that was going to be organized in 2 years later to find out if UK was going to join the euro or not. And at that time, well, we decided we better wait for them. And this is where we enter a very complex situation that, to my understanding, was not helpful neither for the internal market nor for the Eurozone. And this is where we have a rendezvous now. Because UK is I don't know where. And we are in a situation that we have to take care of our house. And this is why in September, in the first European Council after the referendum, where the question of the follow-up after the Brexit was raised, you could see some tension also between France and Germany. The Chancellor Merkel was obviously very, very keen in making sure that all member states would stay together, that we would not create a new division among the EU. And the French President of the Republic at that time was maybe a bit more harsh, pushing for the idea that now we need to fix the house, which means also to really take care of what's happening in the Eurozone, because a good Euro, and I fully share this point of view, not because I'm a French socialist, but because this is my strong belief, that if we don't fix the Eurozone, it will be a drama for everybody, because the EU will not resist the dismantle of the Eurozone. So for me, this gives a sense of the hierarchy. And I hope I've given you a flavor of what it is for me in Multispeed Europe. Thank you.
Sandro, if I may turn to you. We've heard what the two-speed Europe and the multi-speed Europe already exists. How do you see that?
No. Yeah, I agree. Europe has been conceived around the concept of multi-speed Europe. If in 1957 or 1951, the six European democracies had to wait the other European democracies because there were other European democracies that could have joined at the time, well, the Treaty of Paris or the Treaty of Rome wouldn't have started in due time, in 1951, 1957. If when we decided to introduce the euro, the 12 countries which were ready had to wait for those who are not ready, well, probably today we wouldn't have the euro, or we wouldn't be certainly 19 members. When we decided to start to give a concrete meaning to European citizenship, a concrete meaning means free movement of people, 5 countries outside the European Union with the Schengen Convention, 1985 if I'm not mistaken, had to wait for all the other, and had to wait for Italy, which wasn't ready at the time. Probably today we wouldn't have such a deep and wide free movement of people that we have to preserve. So that's my first point. I think that the whole idea of Europe has been based on a group of peoples and countries which decide to do something faster among them, for good reasons and for common objectives. Why I'm not concerned about the risks that someone see, because I don't see multi-speed Europe, or I like to say a speeder Europe. a speedier Europe. Why don't I am not concerned about the concept of a speedier Europe? Because in my view, in our approach as Italian government anyhow, there are three conditions which we think that should ensure efficiency and should reassure those who are concerned. The first is openness. You must be open when you launch an initiative to all the peoples and countries of the European Union who wants to join in the very beginning. The group is not a selective group. The group is an elective group. And this is why this is very different from the approach of Kernel Europa, which was launched in the mid-90s, which was a selective group, where you mentioned the list of countries in the very beginning that should have been, and you basically de facto excluded the other countries. Second, you must be inclusive. Inclusiveness of whom? Of your institutions. Because if you promote new speeder project, you increase the complexity of the system. And if you increase the complexity of the system, you need more, not less, EU institutions. So the second issue is to include EU institutions. The third, as I said, free will, political choice, political decisions. So I go back to my introductory point, an elective group where each country and people choose to be in and not a selective group. Of course, if we can go move ahead towards common objectives that we haven't reached yet, such as a beginning of a defense policy, an effective security policy, a well-functioning Eurozone, if we could go toward notably the first two objectives together, whenever it's possible, we should go there together. 27 countries and even more countries, even those who are associated to the EU and share certain objectives, such as a better security for European people. But whenever it's necessary, you should be ready to accept a faster group. I heard and read that there are some prominent personalities in Europe that say multi-speed Europe would mean European collapse. Well, all the medical studies, recent medical studies prove that your cardio system risks much more to be damaged if you remain in a sedentary life, if you remain in inertia, than if you live a dynamic life, if you move. To move is good for your heart. To move is good for your cardio system. So this is why I think that the collapse could come if we remain in the status quo, not if we decided to move in a more dynamic way. I end up on one point, however, which is very important, because it is clear that this would mean to do something more together, starting from a very important common base, political, social, economic base, which is the European Union which we have today. And there is one thing where I don't think that different speeds are acceptable: rule of law and fundamental rights. On that, all those who are members of the Union, be they happy only with the single market, or be they demanding and hungry for more policy in defense, security, etc., they are all committed to fully respect rule of law and fundamental rights. This is not for free choice, this is not for flexibility, this is not for different speed. On that, we should be demanding for everybody to play the same song.
Thank you very much, Sandro. I realize now that it's very difficult to talk about what multi-speed Europe is without an expressing a view as to whether you think this is a good idea or not. But nevertheless, Peter, if I may turn to you, you come from Switzerland. How do you see this issue of multi-speed Europe? Where does Switzerland fit into this? And what is your view about the future of Europe?
Well, thank you for this invitation. It's honorable European round, but the topic of this panel today is multi-speed Europe, and Switzerland is part of Europe, not part of the European Union. Just to make that clear, although we're probably politically not as speedy in the integrating process into the European Union, but economically we highly integrate into the European Union and rather successful when it comes to the economic dealings. But I think from a Swiss perspective, I mean, we're born with multi-speed Europe, if I may. So we're used to that. We're close to the European Union. We share the common values. But I agree with Sandro. These pillars that must be accepted. These 4 pillars, that means also, you know, the pillars, but also this rule of law. So when we see, I mean, when there are common problems, European problems, even if Switzerland is not part of the European Union, there must be common solutions. You cannot then go back beyond your national borders, like what happens now in the eastern part, in some eastern European countries. Like these core values of rule of law, like democracy, I think that's also important for the Swiss. But what I really appreciate about the discussion today, and what you do also with the 5 scenarios of your commission, with the different scenarios, I mean, you talk about the future of Europe. Although we have a difficult situation, we have a difficult situation too. It's not only European Union countries. With Brexit, with the migration crisis, although now the numbers go a little bit down, but you talk and you discuss it and you try to find a way, and with a kind of open-minded situation, I think there we can learn from you too, because if you don't talk about the scenarios, if you don't discuss it, if you don't fight about it, how do you want to go? What's the way for the future? So I think there we can congratulate from a Swiss perspective also European Union, although, you know, sometimes we have slightly some emotional political conflicts, but that's from my point of view.
Yeah. No, I certainly agree that it is very important to talk about these things and you know, take away the taboo aspect of these issues, because progress cannot be made if it is simply a taboo. Well, let's take the views of our 2 last members of the panel before we come back into sort of a slightly different question. So, Matti, you are also now the presidency of the EU. What is your vision of the future of Europe, and what is Multispeed Europe for you?
Thank you. Good afternoon, and thanks for having invited me. I understand many things better after Sandro's introduction. For me, for an Estonian whose history in the EU is 13 years long, during this time, multi-speed Europe was always, when it was raised in a way of an exclusive club moving on their own and leaving others behind, or telling others, well, you may join if you absolutely have to or absolutely want to, but yeah. So that has been during these our years of our membership. This has been the meaning of this political slogan, coming exclusively from the western part of the continent, or from the older member states, has faded quite quickly in this discussion, but leaving a bit sour aftertaste, nevertheless. That of course we should be, and we are discussing how to develop the EU further. And some wise people like Ivan Krastev in his latest book calls for more flexibility as opposed to just sticking to rigid rules. Mark Leonard in his latest essay calls for groups of member states as opposed to concentric circles. But if you look at those things from the actual practitioner's point of view, you have, what do you have? You have the fundamental values that Sandro very rightly referred to, of course. There cannot be any different speeds. You look at the single market, it can only work if everybody follow the rules. You look at the Eurozone, quite hard to see very different groups within a monetary union. There may be areas, and like smaller areas like patent, like the prosecutor, maybe defense. But even if we end up in some selected areas with different member states, groups of member states moving at a different speed, the EU works in a way, the EU's DNA is, first you want to build consensus. You go out, your starting point is that you want to include everybody. You want to move on with everybody on board. And if in the end some member states want to opt out, then so be it. but you want to have consensus. You want to move ahead, everybody together. So, if I were to discuss how to develop the EU further, I wouldn't start with a multi-speed Europe.
Thank you very much. But what do you mean by why do we need this consensus? I mean, you said that this is in the DNA of the EU, but why is this necessary? Or why is it the choice, if you like? Why have we chosen to do this? And is this a good way forward?
Because the EU is a club of sovereign nations, sovereign states who have taken such a big step, ceding or pooling parts of their sovereignty. Yeah. The commitment is so strong. That's why you want always to have consensus, unanimity in this club.
Okay, thank you. Well, okay, we'll come back to this because this is a very important point. But Mateusz, what is your view on what is multi-speed Europe? And I mean, a view that seems to be emerging is that we already have it. So you know, what's the fuss about? We have multi-speed Europe. Is this? Do you see that the same way, or?
Well, of course we have it, and I mean, to me, the discussion on multi-speed Europe, as opposed to bilateral or multilateral cooperation, requires some involvement of European institutions in the process. Something that Sandro mentioned. An example of that, such a move. Would be banking union, for example, which was negotiated, is operating with new institutions on the European level, was indeed open, and with the exception of, even the Brits did negotiate the creation of it, although they said rather strictly that they want to have nothing to do with it. But I fully agree with Matti that. To start the discussion about reform of the union from the point of let's do a multi-speed. Let's think what needs to be done first, and I think it's not right to ignore the issues because very quickly we'll realize that these multi-speed divisions are not what they seem to be. Related to the previous discussion, for example, in the previous panel. So let me just throw at you some ideas of things to be fixed, possibly with reform, without strong build-up of the mechanism to do it. One is counter-cyclicality, counter-cyclical policy on the EU level, Euro area level, maybe. Fiscal stance, some stability mechanism, answering to macro or major banking crisis. It could be a separate budget related to that. Then there is a question of preventing divergence. Again, both within the EU, and we have such mechanism, and within the Euro area, which is perhaps even more important. Imbalances. Especially within the Euro area where you don't have the exchange rate mechanism. So stronger structural reform, enforcement, something. Symmetry of enforcement of macroeconomic imbalance procedure, making Germans and Dutch spend more. So that kind of things. I'm speaking, exaggerating a bit to illustrate a point, which of course you get. Country level stability. Things that we're trying to address with stronger fiscal rules, stronger institutions. I'm part of the European Fiscal Board and one of the members. So essentially, one of my jobs is a child of that process. Then there is defence, foreign policy, possibly related just to new items on the EU budget, which could be related to that. Then there is taxes, which is an interesting point because the last thing I looked when I was still a member of the ECOFIN was an attempt of enhanced cooperation on financial transaction tax, At the time, myself and George Osborne were saying, we're very interested in that. Who knows? We might want to join this nice, interesting initiative. And I think I haven't been watching it that closely, but I think the future or the outcome of these discussions is as successful as mine and George Osborne's career in politics so far. So it's not really moving too quickly ahead. But that's related to probably the next point.
Well, we seem to have moved into the next part, which is the future and what needs to be done. But you mentioned a couple of very interesting points, and if I can perhaps come back immediately to that, the issue of convergence, for example. Do you think that convergence in Europe can best be achieved if we all move in the same speed? Or could it be perhaps that it can be better achieved, convergence, let's say, in welfare, if we did different things?
I think you need to be careful about using the word speed. And the second way of phrasing it, doing things differently, is maybe more precise and with something I agree with. I mean, of course, depending on the capital to labor ratio or something, you might have different development methods and different ways of doing things. Yeah. Depending on your level of steady state unemployment, if it's almost 20% as in Spain, you might want to run different policies than a country that is running out of labor market and wants to concentrate on in-job training and maybe at the cost of higher rigidity in the labor market. Who knows? So this relates to something I mentioned, forcing structural reforms on a central level, which is always a very tricky thing. So from that point of view, yes, outcomes are certainly much more important than the ways you get there. But this really is not related that closely to providing new institutional setups within the EU. It doesn't need that.
Well, let's take then this conversation forward and come back to the rest of the participants in the panel. But this time, I would like to be a little bit more specific. I'd like to put some meat on the bones. Let's look forward.
Oh, by the way, I need to say that yes, I fully agree that the rule of law is the fundamental thing that is not negotiable, and I strongly hope that the debate that was mentioned will be resolved as quickly as possible and to the overall satisfaction. And I'm a stronger believer in the rule of law than in fiscal rules, for example, which are also important, but that one is even more.
No, thank you for that, certainly. So if I may ask now, if you could now form some demarcation lines. As you see the future advancing in European integration, which parts, specific parts, do you think Europe can afford to run in different speeds, where countries decide to move forward or to step back? And which parts of European integration do you think are real, what we call red lines, and they cannot move in different speeds, we all have to do it together, or else it will not happen? So if I can go back to Pervenche, if I can ask you, where do you think those demarcation lines are?
Okay, so let's start by the beginning. No multi-speed, neither for the internal market, no, and I should have started on this, for the fundamental right. This is absolutely a building block, and you cannot touch anything about this. Second, and I should have said this answering to your first question, I fully agree to the idea that you can see a multi-speed Europe as a solution or as a threat. But this is not my point of interest into the debate. My point of interest into the debate is how do we get out of the mess we are in? And here, I'm quite sure, if we have enlarged the EU, if we have now 28 or 27 member states, the success is that we remain and we keep as strong as possible as a state continent facing globalization. And this means, among the 5 scenarios, I'm not so sure I even like the 5th scenario, but I'm sure some of them I don't like. And what I will be fighting is to make sure that everybody's on board. But then, once you have said this, you need to go to the detail and how to make sure this is going to happen. If I look at the challenge ahead of us, we are not going to mention all of them this afternoon. So I just have to pick up the three main ones. And the three main ones, what are there? The euro, the euro, the euro, migration and defense. And I think the key for the success, if you want to avoid to go for a pure definition of a multi-speed Europe, is to make sure that you have a global deal where you can have loser and winner among these, taking into account a balanced solution or a balanced negotiation with these three chapters. Nevertheless, once this has been said, what is the reality? And I hope somehow we can get out of this round table agreeing that a multi-speed Europe is not the target. It might be at some stage the tool, because life dynamic energy is such that this is how we need to do it. Nevertheless, and this is where I come to my strong point, we have a problem with the Eurozone. Now that the Brits might be going, I don't even know if this is going to happen and how and when, but normally Article 50 has been triggered, but the negotiations are not really in a very good shape. But now that they have clarified that normally they would like to be like Canada or Norway or maybe Switzerland, which they don't even know yet, it's a time for clarification for the euro. And I think questions that have not been raised during the last enlargement now need to be clarified. No country entering into the EU after 2004 have asked for derogation, opt-out. But when the old member state, let's call them like this, even this is not the normal qualification now, had to follow a calendar for joining the euro, this question has never been raised for the current EU. For two reasons. We were not willing to push too harsh and to make it too difficult when the negotiation was already too long, too complex. And on the other side, there was not the willing to give bad signal for the investors. But now we can feel day after day how it's difficult. And the previous debate was obviously here very enlightening, saying if you want a budget for investment, is it going to be for the EU or for the Eurozone? Well, of course, the best answer is for both. But you can see that you have specific dynamic inside the Eurozone that might require, in the end, if the other member states don't join quickly the euro, might need that. I think the current situation does require that we have a budget to support a contra-cyclical policy inside the Eurozone, because the fiscal compact and the other rules do have a counter effect that need to be combated. And if you have a budget for the Eurozone, then you will have a problem or representation in the parliament. And this is something quite new. Up to now in the parliament, we avoided, when we had Schengen, but every MEP's vote on Schengen. We have the hearing with Draghi and before Trichet, and everybody can raise questions to them. But the day you have a budget with own resources, the question becomes very different. And this is why I would much prefer, first, I believe we do need to fix the Eurozone to have a budget, fiscal capacity, blah, 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 and a fair representation, especially following the very, very bad experience we had with Greece, because with Greece there has been a denial of democracy. And this is not acceptable if we believe in our fundamental rights and our fundamental value for the EU. In Greece, you had a troika defining what would be the political contract for this country outside any parliamentary debate in the in-camera of a new Eurogroup. This is not democracy.
If I may, just on this point, how do you stay faithful to democratic principles and at the same time make sufficient advancement in sort of an integration? Yeah. How do you square that circle?
Well, this is why I believe there's a key role here to be played by the Parliament, and this is not a plaidoyer pour the mot, it's just a matter of fact. If you want to keep this dynamic of being inclusive and to fight for everybody to be on board, it needs to be in the Parliament, but at some stage, if we will need to go for a budget of the Eurozone, then the question of who can vote will be raised.
Thank you. So I'm getting the impression then that we should try and do all together, and the multi-speed is only an outcome, a concession, is not an objective.
Second best choice.
Sandro, do you agree with that, or do you think the multi-speed is perhaps an opportunity for Europe?
No, I do believe that this is certainly a method, a tool, and any method, any tool is an opportunity if you decide to use it in the proper way. It is clear, yes, I do believe that it is an opportunity, but it's clear that the goal is to reach the common objective that we have identified in the treaties. But if at a certain stage there are some countries, some peoples who want to move faster toward those common objectives, this shouldn't be dramatized. Because after all, they are not doing different things. They are doing only faster a thing that we have commonly agreed. And this is the point. I think that we have to get out of the dramatization of, oh my God, they are going faster. Because, as I said, if you do not have appetite for Europe of defense, you cannot oblige those who have this appetite to have a fasting for many years, because if you fast for many years, you die. Or you lose interest in certain things. And I think that nobody wants that anybody lose interest in a certain things called European Union, European integration. So I do believe that we need, and I think that this time, in this period, the conditions are there, and the time is ripe to build up a beginning of Europe of defense. Shall we have to wait for 27 members? No, I can tell you, no. Because probably there will never be 27 governments, state and people that will want to engage in the same way on a Europe of defense. But for budgetary reasons, for internal reasons, because Europeans cannot continue to be security consumer and must start to be a little bit security providers. We need to develop a Europe of defense. We are ready. There are 4 countries, we go ahead with 4 countries. But based on a strong cooperation with the institution. We are 7, let's go ahead with 7. And I'm sure that if you are clear that it is not a new objective, it is not an exclusive club, but it's a way of reaching, targeting in a more efficient and faster way common objectives, the number of the countries will join any specific fast initiative will be much higher than we think today. The point that we cannot oblige anybody to accept to start and to faster a process which can be also complex for domestic reasons, for example, building up a security policy, but we cannot accept that anybody with a single veto block us. The point is to be very clear among us that, I mean, the opting out have been negotiated one by one by specific countries. The other countries who haven't negotiated opting out when they decided to join, they are not entitled today to block those countries who want to move ahead in a fast and efficient way toward the common objectives. This is one fundamental, this is not a question, this is a fundamental political understanding that we must reach. And I think that if we reach this fundamental political understanding, things can go much better. Then there is a specific, for me, the Eurozone as such, as I already said, it is a faster and a Europe with high density. So I don't want a speeder group within the Eurozone. I want the Eurozone to wake and to speed up in reshaping. And there I end up with to clarify a little bit our position. we always talk, and Matti and Pervenche knows very well, that we always talk about completing the economic and monetary union. Well, dear friends, I'm not sure that the verb is the right one. Probably reshaping the Eurozone would be a much more adequate term, because I'm not sure that everything we have decided, notably during the crisis, must totally be confirmed, and that everything we have decided during the crisis has proved so efficient, so consensual, that cannot be put in question. So I would say, let's open a debate on how to reshape the Eurozone, and we are very keen in starting this debate.
But part of this reshaping of the Eurozone also includes a scenario in which a few countries, a number of countries, decide that the way forward is to deepen the fiscal integration. And then you talked about the three principles of being selective, inclusive, and of course the free will. There are other countries who would say, well, I'm not interested in something like that. Do you think it's still a good idea, countries within the Eurozone, to progress in this, and they will be respecting all your criteria?
This is a very complicated question, because, of course, if you ask me what is my option is to reshape the Eurozone as a whole, as it stands now, not to create a division within the Eurozone. And I'm sure, honestly, I don't want to sound too naive or too optimistic or pessimistic, but I'm sure that this is the shared understanding of everybody in the Eurozone, because I'm sure that and more, even in my country, the geniuses that until 6 months ago wanted to organize a referendum to get out of the Eurozone, after a certain election over the Alps, are very silent, are very shy. They don't talk about getting out of the Eurozone anymore. But the point is that we need seriously to sit around the table and to see, for us, yes, for us there is a there are some fundamental weaknesses in the Eurozone. The first is lack of true investment policy and investment capacity. So let's have a debate about that. Shall we do it with a specific budget? Shall we do it with a specific plan? Shall we do it through an evolution of the economic stability mechanism? It is clear that it must be to have a counter-cyclical positive economic policy. It is not to have a new, tighter surveillance instrument. And this, for example, is one of the debates that I think that we might have in a couple of months in the Europe, and we are very keen in having this debate.
Thank you very much. So possibly multi-speed on defense, but reform the Eurozone before you start dividing it. Peter, what about the rest of the EU, and what about the rest of Europe?
Well, if I may add one sentence, as a proud representative of the strong Swiss franc, I doubt that Switzerland ever enters the Eurozone, if I may say so.
Well, I've entered the EU before.
Yes, I know. No, I think multi-speed Europe is also a window of opportunity for Switzerland, for countries outside the European Union. Because probably we find better our place there, how much we want to integrate, what is accepted from your side. But we have every interest in a prosperous Europe for sure, and we're rather happy that we have the single market is top of the top for us too. So Europe must stay also a reliable partner. We see that the decision-making process gets most probably a little bit more complicated in the European Union, but we also think it's a kind of a window of opportunity for the European Union to a certain extent, because you know, as Swiss, we are federalists, and we try to delegate everything, principle of subsidiarity, and you have this principle too. So what we think, we also should discuss what still should be kind of regulated on the top European level, and what is the chance to give it back to a certain extent to the nations, to the national level, to even to the regional level. So we don't see it negative. What we always also say is there are some things that really emotionalize, bother the people, like migration, especially migration. We know the crisis. I mean, it's also hotly discussed in Switzerland. Also defense to a certain extent, when you see now all this kind of chaotic days and months and even years ahead. So I think there Europe together. Also the Switzerland as part of the Europe, not part of the European Union. There, I think we have to give answers to our people to still to be credible. But on the other side, to a certain extent, also we should discuss the principle of subsidiarity. What probably should be given back to the national authorities, and what is necessary to be regulated on the European EU level.
Thank you very much. That was very interesting. So then let me, in the interest of time, let me quickly turn to Matti. You talked about consensus. I think it's probably an accurate way of describing the way that Europe operates. So as we move forward, in the future of Europe, which areas do you think we need to have consensus in? And which areas do you think we can afford not to have consensus in and perhaps move in multiple speeds? You already touched on this in your earlier intervention.
It's a very matter-of-fact question. Sandro was talking about defense, and it's quite possible that in the field of defense we may end up with an arrangement that not all member states will take part. I mean, some member states may have constitutional restrictions. The perception of security challenges may still differ, and so on. That, of course, the more member states will participate, the stronger this arrangement will be. It's clear as well. The areas that may, if you leave aside single market, if you leave aside Eurozone, as has been argued in this panel already, the areas you may still maybe find different groups, different speeds. Justice and Home Affairs would come to mind. The Prüm arrangement was one of the first examples of different fields of cooperation. And in JHA affairs also geography may matter sometimes, and so on. At the same time, of course, we are seeing how borderless we have become now, especially against the background of the recent terrorist attacks and how those people had moved throughout Europe, leaving traces which we cannot trace because our databases don't interact, and our law enforcement authorities don't work together as they should. In the field of the CFSP, I would rather say that first we need to have a real common policy in that area. As we speak, the foreign ministers of the EU member states, the 28, are discussing at the Gymnich meeting in Tallinn. They are discussing the working methods, meaning how to achieve more coherence in our external action, and that gives you an answer on that one as well. One point maybe on the decision-making process is very fashionable to say, and I've heard that for 20 years, even before we acceded, even before the Big Bang, the big enlargement. Now the decision-making process gets hugely complex and time-consuming. Once had a Belgian colleague who had worked for Coreper at that time when there were only 6 member states in early 1970s. He said, well, the Coreper meetings lasted as long as they do now with 27. People big, long speeches, enjoying, drinking cognac, and so on. So I'm not buying this decision-making argument.
Thank you very much for a very clear answer, actually. And then finally, Mateusz, if I can come back to you, you mentioned a number of different areas for informing the euro area, but where again do you think we need consensus in these areas for, and which areas do you think we can do without much consensus, and therefore allowing countries to proceed as they see fit?
Well, one area that I again need to agree with is the single market, and that is not an easy. I mean, it's an easy thing to say, but the meaning of keeping single market intact and not damaging it via multi-speed is actually quite profound, because there's a number of ideas floating around, and for the same reasons why countries do not have separate legislation or they're harmonized, we cannot have multiple speeds, be it whatever, consumer safety regulations, because then suddenly the single market doesn't work anymore. There could be say, minimum wage pact, for example. I could imagine a situation like that. And that is just one step away from, the price of this product is too low, so you cannot sell it, because that's effectively what you end up with. So, so on one hand, we have the panels like this debating about opening of services market, but at the same time, we have a parallel debate on delegated workers, for example. So, these things are related, and they should not be taken lightly, because the reason why we have a number of regulations and harmonization of various things is exactly to have a smoothly functioning single market. So, I would, time and time again, Euro area has been mentioned, and I think I need to say that I think it's overdone in a sense, the importance of the division between Euro area and non-Euro area. I mean, what's been just said that yes, multiple speed, yes, but not within the Euro area. I think the biggest, some of the things I mentioned, I already sort of alluded to that, about what could be a direction of a reform. There's such a huge disagreement among Euro area members that I find it very, very hard to believe that much progress is going to be made in a near term. Even if we believe on the name of a finance minister or whatever, then what it actually means is something completely different. European Fiscal Board is one example that suddenly, we kind of agreed that it needs to be created, but then what exactly it needs to do, it was another story altogether. Coordination of policies. One of the mandates of the European Fiscal Board is to advise the Commission on the Euro area fiscal stance. And time again, on the EFC and various European bodies, I see the same discussion. Where is this European fiscal stance in the treaties? I mean, you're not going to tell us what. So we're quite far away from any agreement on this, and relating to the discussion in the previous panel, I don't think the elections here or there are going to change much in that case, in that area. Maybe, yeah, but it will be a very difficult movement, and it's actually very useful when debating what to do, how to change things, and what countries should participate, to be quite precise about what we're addressing. Are we addressing a general move, ability to act counter-cyclically? I mean, it's primarily up to countries to do it. Yeah? And if they cannot do it, why is that? If they do it, if they behave in a non-European fashion, meaning that there are spillovers that they don't take into account, which is probably true, then there is a room for pan-European instrument. But should it be Euro area or maybe more general, and so forth? Yeah? And if so, what kind of EU budget or Euro area budget are we talking about? I mean, maybe current size of it is vastly insufficient for what we are expecting it from. So these are quite difficult discussions. Meaning, and I think talking about multi-speed or non-multi-speed first is again, it's not the right. I mean, first let's see what needs to be fixed and let's agree how to fix it, and then we'll see who's on board and who is not.
But if I may dwell on this point, because I really think it is a controversial point, and we need to talk about it, certainly in the context of Multispeed Europe, on this Eurozone issue. And I don't think we disagree. There is so much disagreement. I think that I think is correct. We do disagree about how to move forward. But the question here is, what are our options? Do we need to agree in order to move forward? Or can we, some of us agree and do certain things and just move in different directions within the Eurozone? I mean, I think that's the issue that we need to discuss here. I have no trouble believing that it's very difficult to advance. But do you think it is necessary to advance, even if that means only some of us? Or it's only important that we move all in a consensus way, otherwise it will be the beginning of the end? I think that's the issue here. Can we think of a world in which countries in the Eurozone, and I think members of the panel have been very clear, Sandro, you disagree that no, the Eurozone, we have to do it all together. But you seem to be, Mateusz, you seem to be implying that there's so much disagreement that in the name of progress, we need to move forward, even if it's just a subset of us. And I think that's a question we can't run away from. I think we need to sort of address this question because, and respect all the principles you talked about, the principles of human rights in particular, the principles on which the EU was founded. But I think it's important to try and think about this in a way that doesn't create divisions, because I think that's important, but it is something that helps the European project be sustainable, certainly in the long run. So what are our options here?
All right, I mentioned the question, what we're trying to address. Yeah? So the two things within the Eurozone, if we're talking about the Eurozone, that are probably worth addressing is the question of imbalances. And not everyone agrees on that, and ability to act in a counter-cyclical way when monetary policy doesn't work anymore. So it's not so much about divisions within, but the overall stance. For imbalances, and unfortunately, the answers are not necessarily compatible. So if we believe that a big surplus countries within the euro area are a problem, like relative imbalances are a problem, that the answer to that is more spending in these countries. Oh yeah, but it is divisions within the euro area.
But, I mean, for example, when we discuss convergence or imbalances, to say that, let's put the question right blunt on the question, on the table, that Germany need to spend more and that France need to reform. This is not a multi-speed Europe. It's a distribution of tasks. This is absolutely not the same thing we are discussing. When we discuss multi-speed Europe, maybe we were not clear enough in the first round when we defined what is multi-speed Europe. De facto, if this is a question for the debate today, it's because after Brexit, this has appeared as a fear for some country to see that others would speed up without leaving them on the sidewalk. And this is what they don't want. And I think this is what we don't want. But to say that to meet a target, which is, for example, the reshaping of the EMU, each member state must do the same thing in the same speed. This is not true. It's like we had, when we were joining to the euro, we had the snake. So there were some country up, there were some country down, and we were converging. But if you want to converge, there are different moves from different member states. So we are discussing two different, completely different things.
I was answering the question, but it's. I agree that it is not multi-speed within particular group. But if we're talking about creating a new instruments in the European Union that is open to some of the members, that's multi-speed, or that's deepening the speeds, or making the differences in speeds different. Yeah? So if you're creating a new fiscal instruments that is open to some of the countries, that is, well, yes, but it's not, EU is not the Eurozone only. Yeah? There are some members, Denmark, Sweden, and some others that are still outside.
But then the question is the Eurozone. The question is not the fiscal capacity inside the Eurozone.
Well, I mean, I think this is a very good time to actually bring the audience in. I think there will be times there will be time to react to this, but I'd like to see how our public thinks about this. And I mean, I think these are very interesting questions because what Mateusz, if I understand correctly, is saying that if we had more advance on some of these issues, the answer of Multispeed Europe would be so much easier to address. And I think that there is an element there. But let's just collect a few questions and then come back to the panel and get an opportunity to react. I see already a hand there. There and there. Let's take those 3 questions first. Right at the back first, please.
Right at the back.
Yeah.
I was in. Okay.
There was a hand there. Yeah.
Oh, it's right at the front. Okay.
Yes.
Okay. Professor Listen from the IMNRC. I don't know. I like to offer an alternative solution. The best way to advance Europe, or perhaps the world, is perhaps to explore how the mindsets of citizens, not just in the EU but worldwide, prepare the mindsets of citizens, not just in the EU but worldwide, for a transition to new global governance that invites collective citizen and institution collaboration on an equal footing. We are faced with a global network of interconnected global challenges that can only be appropriately managed by first setting up a new global governance infrastructure. Thank you.
Thank you. There was a gentleman here, please.
Kurt Geisert, Association of German SMEs. I have a question for Mr. Szczurek, and you encouraged me because you spoke about the rule of law. If I interpret it correctly, there's a discussion within the European Commission how to treat the Polish government as far as rule of law is concerned. From your perspective as a member of the former Polish government, would you prefer a way of proceeding very consequent or very cautious? Thank you.
And then my last question with Marek.
Marek Dąbrowski, Bruegel. I can accept various pragmatic arguments in favor of multi-speed or variable geometry, however we call, especially in some new areas of integration which do not trade in such fundamental things like fundamental rights on the single market. But what about cost in terms of governability of the EU? You mentioned, for example, about the role of European Parliament, that as far as this question of questioning government of ECB is not a big problem, but when things comes to some sub-budget, this will be a big problem. I think that there are already problems, because if we look for the sum of all opt-outs, temporary derogation, enhanced cooperation, also some form of integration regulated outside the treaty. We have already quite a lot of this variable geometry, and we have theoretically single institution, Commission, Council, and Parliament. Are here some limits of this approach?
Well, Mateusz, do you want to go first? There was a question directly addressed to you, and then I would like to have at least one more round of questions, so if I can ask you to have brief interventions.
My answer will be rather quick. I would prefer the conflict and the issue of the rule of law to be resolved internally, and I hope it is going to happen. The experience of Austria and Haider and the past examples of that, I don't think were very successful in this respect. But that said, it is, I hope it's going to happen, but at the same time, I hope it will be possible. Again, I'm not in a position to comment on either side at this stage, even.
Thank you. Sandro, would you like to?
Yes, on the different questions.
Yes, on the different questions. Pick what you think is.
I start from the last one. It is clear that there are many words that have been used, variable geometry, different degree of intensity of integration, and in some cases already to use international instrument and not community instrument, EU instrument, has been the consequences of the internal opposition of some member states. After all, if even a summa of rules which are not always, in my view, extremely intelligent, like the fiscal compact, has been done through an international treaty, it's because there were people, countries within the European Union which were opposed to that. So we could say that there's already a new form of speedier Europe, or stronger Europe with a stronger will or stronger mind, because obviously those countries who decided to use an international treaty to wrap up the two-pack and six-pack rules, what a name, and adding some other extremely smart, between brackets, rules, they really wanted, and they decided to overcome the opposition. Now we have to decide whether to insert the fiscal compact into the treaty. Personally, I'm against, but not because I want to open a debate on how to reshape the Eurozone. And if I want to open a debate about to reshape the Eurozone, I cannot say at the day one, first hour, everything has been done is good. Because I don't think that everything has been done is good, and because I want to debate. But having a debate is part of a democracy, of a government, of a parliament, and of an organization, and it is part of the European Union. So it's not because we have today different, thanks God we have different views, because that means that we have views. I would be worried if we didn't have views on how to reshape the Eurozone. It is clear there are views who I can see are nearer my views, views that at the beginning are more far, but this is the essence of a debate, and this is the essence of the debate on how to reshape the Eurozone that we must have. But once again, I do not believe that we have, we must try, and this must be our political choice, to engage all together the 19, and I hope more, in the near future, member of the Eurozone to engage all together in a debate on how to reshape. Then, there are many things who are not in the treaty. You say that fiscal stance is not in the treaty. I do believe that to start to talk about a fiscal stance of the euro as a whole has been one of the very good progress that we have achieved to produce since 2014. And we are not totally stranger to the beginning of this process. Now, the European Commission is very proud to talk about this, but I say that as Italy, we are not totally stranger to the beginning of this day. I think it is a positive development. The output gap and the way we calculate the output gap, probably, for example, it's another issue on which we have to open a debate. Because there are at least 8 countries, members of the Eurozone who say the way it is okay to have a structural deficit approach, which is not the nominal deficit approach of the Treaty of Maastricht at the beginning, but the way we calculate this can be flawed. And so, let's open a debate. This is not multi-speed Europe. This is having a political debate on a very important issue, which is the Eurozone, and which is how to put flesh on the bones of the structures. You mentioned, it was it can sound pretty utopian to talk about a global governance, but I can recall anyhow that when Altiero Spinelli was thinking of the United States of Europe, was seeing the United States of Europe as the first step towards a United States of the world, the global governance. I don't think it is for tomorrow. I think that, however, we must do much more to make the G20 more efficient, and probably we should thinking of a new governance about the G20, because it is clear that we must go beyond common declaration and beyond also an economic approach, and we are doing so, but that's a place where we can address a new way of approaching the governance of global issues, it is the time also to rethink some aspect of the Bretton Woods institution, but this is something we have been saying in the last 20 years. That's still true, so I take the encouragement that comes from that question. The question was to Mateusz. I allow myself to share my views. Rule of law, it is our identity. If there is a way of describing European identity is respect of rule of law and fundamental freedoms. It is not a single market. I'm sorry. Because we have done all this after the Second World War. We have done all this after that we Europeans create Auschwitz and the Shoah. This is what Europe is. So, as this Europe is, let's be serious about fundamental values. Let's be serious about the independence of the Constitutional Court. Let's be serious about commitment that we've taken when we founded Europe. Let's be serious about commitment that we've taken when we joined Europe. And they are much more valid when you are within EU than when we want to join. And if we want to be credible to all our citizens, with our debate on the Eurozone, with our debate on the output gap, with our debate on whether we have to do a correction of 0.3% of the deficit of 0.8, well, we better become much more credible and serious when we talk about democracy, rule of law, and fundamental rights. Otherwise, the citizen won't believe to us anymore.
Thank you, Sandro. Thank you very much. Matti, your
thanks. I elaborate on the last question. It's not a proper moment for me to be too critical about the governability of the EU. My country is now trying to do its part in the Council of the EU, and hopefully with some success. But what we saw, what we experienced during the migration crisis, 2015, 2016, was not about all the layers, all the bodies of governance that we have, but about one body, one person we did not have. The EU doesn't have a general. The EU does not have a headquarters to manage an acute operational crisis. And if one stretch of your border is effectively open and thousands of people come in daily, I would call it an operational crisis. In order to manage that, you need an operational headquarters, you need a general, and that we don't have.
Thank you, Matti. Berès?
Yes, I would like to start my answer exactly on this point, because just yesterday there was a very important decision by the court that did sanction two states not for accepting the relocation of asylum seeker. So this is where the institution do fully have their value. So we don't have a headquarter, I do agree. Nevertheless, I think here maybe it would have been better with a headquarter, but maybe it would have been better also if the member state had not been so shy, selfish, or I don't know what's the word to use, reacting to Juncker's proposition on relocation. Because relocation was proposed earlier in May 2015, exactly in a very timely manner and a very balanced manner. And it was thrown out by member state that for some of them were also the one later on to accuse the other one to go for a multi-speed Europe against them. So this cannot be. Let's be blunt. The rule of law is the heart of the union, and you cannot, on the one hand, not respect the rule of law, and on the other hand, accuse the other one to go for a multi-speed Europe. This is not consistency. So this is why I think the only consistent approach is to be faithful in the institution of the union and to make sure that everybody is on board as much as possible without any derogation, neither to the internal market nor to the rule of law. And I'm sorry that in the current situation, obviously things are a bit moving vis-à-vis Poland, but for political reasons we have not been harsh as harsh vis-à-vis Hungary, where Orban, because he belongs to the EPP, was much more protected than the Polish government. This is, in the end, this is also a situation we are creating where we lost the trust of our citizen. When it comes to the articulation between Multispeed Europe and in EU institution, I've already mentioned some of it. But for me, as an MEP, I can tell you, during the last period, I have seen two scandals, which is the European Stability Mechanism and the Fiscal Compact. The European Stability Mechanism, of course, it's been settled under the condition of member states that wanted it exactly like this. Because there was an urgency, we accepted it, but in the end, you have something that have a potential to represent 5% of the GDP of the Eurozone member state. It's not a tiny envelope, huh? 5% of the GDP of Eurozone member state. And this budget is absolutely out of any control. And don't tell me that the Bundestag is controlling it. The Bundestag might control what Germany is doing. But the ESM and Klaus Regling very frequently comes to the Econ Committee. He's very polite. He answers to our question and blah, blah, blah. But we have no teeth to find out what's happening with this whole envelope. I'm not saying they are doing a bad job. But I'm just saying in terms of democratic control, we are not there. So we are not faithful to our fundamental value of the EU. And when it comes to the Fiscal Compact is an intergovernmental treaty. But it uses the institution of the Union. The Commission is the engine of the Fiscal Compact. This is not acceptable. Sorry, it was a bit blunt, but this is what I think of the situation.
I just want to be brief, so there's still room for questions. No, I mean, from outside, no. From a European view outside the European Union, just very brief. I think when I see discussion in Switzerland, I mean, when we see that basic principles, like as you said, the rule of law, are touched or denied, I mean, then we also talk and discuss the credibility. And I think there we all have to start, all as Europeans, because Switzerland is also, in Switzerland also we have the rule of law. And then we have to solve the problems that the people feel most in their heart. And then we can increase the credibility first, and secondly, then we can talk about the development process of Europe. That's my personal conviction.
Thank you very much. We have time for one more question, and then I would like to ask our panelists to give us a final thought. The lady over there has the last question. Is it correct? Oh, yeah, it is a lady. Yeah.
Juliette Samuel from the Telegraph, and I have a question relating to where you started the discussion on the idea of multi-speed Europe, starting in the 80s with the single market, and I think it was also with the introduction of the euro later that, or the starting on that road, that was also the period in which Euroscepticism in the UK moved from quite a marginal thing to becoming a larger political force. And so I wonder what you think about the danger, or how you navigate the idea of, if a collection of states go forward and integrate more, what do you do to the political balance in the other states and their support for the EU and their feeling of input to it?
That's a very good question, actually. So Euroscepticism and multi-speed Europe, is multi-speed a way of increasing Euroscepticism, or is it a way of diffusing the system and actually reducing Euroscepticism? I think that's a very good question to close by. And with that, I'd like to ask you also to give us your, let's say, one final thought on the issue. We'll start with you, Mateusz, if I may.
I understand that the reason why Britain opted out was to diffuse a backlash from the population. So my guess would be there was a way to protect against against opposition to the EU as a whole, and I think this could be extended to perceived overreach of European institutions on some areas that are seen by countries as better left to sovereign domain. As usual, I mean, this is an age-old debate. When regulating on the European level, let's make sure this is done where there are externalities, where there's value of unity.
Thank you. Sandro, multi-speed Europe is good for Euroscepticism, or?
Well, I mean, it is a very, very well-put question, and the answer varies according to the capital of the country you look at it from. In Italy, Euroscepticism has been increasing a lot in these years because of lack of European action. It has been increasing a lot because Italians didn't find Europe where they thought Europe should have been, in the Mediterranean, for example, in developing effective migration policies, in managing in a much more effective way the external border, in developing more effective counter-cyclical economic and social policies. So from this perspective, I would say that seen from Rome, a speedier Europe in addressing common challenges and common concern is a good recipe to fight against Euroscepticism. From UK, I mean, it has been a different perspective, but after all, I can tell you what I think because I told to my British friend, I spent 2 full days in London yesterday and the day before. UK has always opted out from everything, was smelling of, touching sovereignty in some key field. Think home affairs, think security, think other issues. In my view, one of the reasons, not only one of the reasons, is certainly that the Europe has been slow, has been ineffective, has shown a certain ineffectiveness in addressing certain issues, even if UK wasn't in, but the fact that, for example, the Eurozone wasn't working. It wasn't an economic, it wasn't a direct formal UK concern, but certainly it didn't help in displaying an image of a club where you want to remain. But I do believe that if you do, and this has been the case in UK for many years, if you do Euro bashing from Monday to Saturday, if from Monday to Saturday you say that all your problems come from Brussels and all the best solution can be developed in London, and then on Sunday you say, hey guys, there is something new, I ask you to vote to remain in the EU, it is rather difficult that you win the referendum. That's what I think.
Thank you very much, Sandro. Matti?
Thanks. I think as far as the public opinion is concerned, or the hesitations, more related to the concerns or reluctance to cede or pool sovereignty, rather than any discussion about the governance of the EU. I take Sandro's point. If people see that the EU is delivering concrete results, concrete benefits for them, it increases the support for the EU. This is not to underestimate, however, the slight toxicness, if that's a word in English, of the notion of the multi-speed Europe. If conducted in a way that I started in my introduction, if conducted in a way and if perceived in a way that some guys want to go alone and leave the rest behind, in my part of Europe, the fear of being left out is something very fundamental based on our historic experience, and you don't want to play games with that.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you for this very political question for concluding our roundtable. I think this was really the right question to be raised. I would like to make 3 points to conclude. The first one, an introduction. I think we agree here that multi-speed Europe can only be a positive dynamic, and can never be a closed, exclusive approach. And it never can touch nor rule of law, nor internal market. This being said, first, regarding UK, come on, let's not be naive. this referendum has been organized because internal dispute in the conservative camp were not resolved by Cameron. And the whole EU, UK, and the whole EU is hostage of this. And the answer that came from the British people has nothing to do with to find out if it was multi-speed Europe or so on. It's the same reason why Trump wins in the US and why the Front National was in the second round in the French presidential election. It's because the one to whom we had sold the internal market as the true recipe for growth and job didn't work, or they were left out of it. And for me, this is the most political lesson that needs to be taken out of the Brexit. And this is what I don't like in the current situation, that we are very much fighting to find out how to solve the question on the table. Fair enough, the border, the citizenship, the budget, that the money that the UK needs to give back to the EU. But if we only do this, and if we don't look why in the country that had sold to its people globalization, free trade as the best economic miracle for the 21st and the 20th century, and that is now in this backlash again openness, again free trade, well, we will lose all. And for me, this is the first lesson. So it's a very political one. That means internal market only for cross-border company will not work. And this is why I would like to say something about what you said regarding subsidiarity, because subsidiarity is very good, except, for example, for me now on taxation issue, where it's with Switzerland, where we have sometimes a problem, because you have the argument that it's in the competence of federal state, and you cannot do things in the general level of Switzerland. This, I think, it's not a good subsidiarity, of course, and I think we need to move on. Second, what is the problem in the relation of the citizenship, or the feeling of citizen vis-à-vis the EU? I think up to now, somehow we've been building the EU very much exactly like an internal market. And because of this, we have given up some kind of discourse that was absolutely needed on what is an EU sovereignty. And this is true inside member state of the Eurozone, for example, where we have not developed the concept of a sovereignty of our currency, and what does it mean in terms of social standards, taxation, harmonization, and so on. And in a country like yours, but also some of your neighbor, I think there has been a cheat, because the negotiations were very much about being member of an internal market, and in a historical period of recovery of sovereignty, what it means to share sovereignty in Brussels, this is something we have not discussed so much, or not enough. And now the only way ahead is to be much stronger on what is the rule of law, and to respect also the proudness of each member state. And in these conditions, which is quite a heavy agenda, I admit, but I think this is the way forward, then you can first you can achieve some result, and reconciliate a citizen with the EU. At least I have one good news, or one, I can see one good thing, is that obviously in the French presidential election, even if my party lost, the question of the EU was one of the questions in the center of the election, and it's on this basis that it was won.
When it comes to fiscal competition, subsidiarity, I think this is a little bit the cultural difference between the French and the Swiss. We can discuss that in another round. No, I just want to be brief and in general. I think, as a Swiss, although half of our population do have also other national origins, I'm also half Austrian. But as a Swiss, you kind of accept to a certain extent inequalities, because due to our federalistic competition. And I think this also to a certain extent is valid for Europe. But there's some rules, as you said, basic pillars that must be valid for all. That's the first point. And the second point is, I think if we deliver results, deliver results that have directly an impact on the prosperity of the people, of the European people, of the Germans, of the French people, and they see, hey, the European idea, what they do in Brussels, what they do in the capitals of the European countries, even if they're non-EU countries, I think then also multi-speed Europe has a future. But we have to address directly the people, not only the fears, but also show them that the European idea has a positive impact on the prosperity, and then Europe has always a chance.
Thank you very much, Peter. That's a very big point. So at the risk of not reflecting everybody's view, I mean, I'm delighted that we have consensus on certainly the importance of fundamental rights. I think that's something uncompromisable. I think I also learned that in Europe we like to draw consensus, and that when we don't draw consensus, that's a second best solution. But there are areas we need to move in together, the single market. I sense also the euro you feel we need to do all together, common foreign and security policy possibly. But there are areas that we can perhaps move in multiple speeds, but only as a second best. But with that, I fear that we are going to hear a lot more on this in the future. But in the meantime, thank you all for coming, for taking the time to be in Brussels for our event today. And please join me in thanking our panelists.